Today, we're exploring a powerful tale of unforeseen change and redemption. It all begins with Ethan, a decorated soldier returning home after his most recent deployment, eager to enjoy a rare first-class flight. What should have been a well-deserved moment of pride and tranquility quickly spirals into a heated confrontation when he encounters unfair treatment from a fellow passenger, Claire. Her discriminatory behavior sets off a series of events that not only challenge Ethan's dignity, but ignite an unexpected chain reaction. This single moment becomes a turning point that alters both their lives in profound ways. How did Ethan's composed response lead to such dramatic consequences? How did one incident reveal deeper truths and inspire meaningful change? Stay tuned to find out. And before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from today. If this story of resilience and transformation touches your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Ethan let out a measured breath as he moved through the bustling halls of Crescent International Airport. The weight of his duffel bag was a constant reminder of the miles he had traveled. His weary eyes scanned the lively terminal filled with people rushing by, heads down, lost in their own worlds. Unlike them, Ethan was composed. Exhausted, yes, but calm. It felt good to be back after months overseas, where every day carried the risk of danger. The thought of returning to his family made it all worth it, a reward he'd been yearning for during countless sleepless nights. He walked with purpose, though his stride was slower than usual. His aching muscles and stiff joints bore the Ethans of someone who had been through far more than most could fathom, yet he carried himself with pride. Ethan's uniform, freshly pressed for the occasion, stood out in the sea of travelers, drawing the occasional glance. He was used to the attention. It came with his line of work. In his hand, he clutched his first-class ticket tightly, the crisp paper offering a small sense of reassurance. The ticket was more than just a seat assignment. It was a symbol of something he had earned. Ethan thought back to the day he purchased it, hesitating for a moment, knowing the money could be spent on his wife or daughter instead. But after weeks of grueling missions and nights under the stars in a combat zone, he convinced himself this was something he deserved. A brief moment of comfort and peace amid a chaotic world. As he approached the check-in counter, the familiar hum of the airport surrounded him. The roll of suitcases, the chatter of passengers, and the distant, muffled announcements. Ethan gave the attendant a polite but weary smile as she checked his boarding pass. "Thank you for your service, sir," she said, handing it back to him with a respectful nod. Ethan simply returned the gesture, accustomed to such acknowledgments. Though well-meaning, they weren't what he sought. What he truly wanted was to be home, to embrace his family again and hold his little girl close. The thought of her smile filled his heart with a bittersweet ache. Just a few more hours, he reminded himself. As he made his way to the first-class lounge, his mind drifted to the sacrifices he had made. He thought of the long nights on patrol, the friends he had lost, and the heavy decisions that still lingered in his conscience. But amidst the struggles were moments of camaraderie and a sense of purpose. Reasons that had driven him to serve in the first place. Those sacrifices had brought him here, and soon, in a matter of hours, he would be reunited with the people who mattered most. That thought kept him grounded. When the first-class boarding area came into view, Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. Finally, he would have a chance to relax before the long flight home. His eyes scanned the room filled with plush seats and travelers, most of whom were preoccupied, business people glued to their laptops and older couples chatting softly. Ethan stepped forward, his quiet determination carrying him toward the seat that would mark the beginning of his journey home. Little did he know, a simple confrontation in this tranquil lounge would set the stage for a story that would change lives forever. Then his gaze landed on a woman seated by the window. Claire. She was impossible to miss, dressed immaculately in a tailored blazer, with gleaming heels and an expensive handbag perched on the seat next to her. Claire radiated an air of superiority, her coiffed hair and sparkling watch adding to the impression. Everything about her screamed wealth and entitlement. She sat with her chin slightly lifted, eyes sweeping the room as though she owned it. Ethan didn't give her much thought at first. He wasn't one to judge people by appearances. Years in the military had taught him that looks could be deceiving, and everyone had their own story. However, as he approached the empty seat beside her, Claire's demeanor shifted. Her posture stiffened, and her sharp eyes locked on him, narrowing slightly, her lips pressed into a tight, disapproving line as if his very presence was offensive. "Excuse me," Ethan said evenly as he stopped beside her. "I believe this is my seat." Claire didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let her gaze sweep over him, slowly and deliberately. There was no mistaking the disdain on her face. For a moment, it seemed she might simply ignore him altogether. Finally, she spoke, her tone dripping with condescension. "Are you sure?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. Her eyes darted briefly to his uniform and then back to his face. "This is first class." Ethan's jaw tensed, but he kept his tone steady. "Yes, I'm sure. This is my seat." Claire leaned back in her chair, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. She studied him again, her scrutiny even more pointed this time. The skepticism in her eyes was unmistakable. She didn't believe for a second that someone like him belonged in first class. "Well, I find that hard to believe," she said with a thin, dismissive smile. "You must have made a mistake. This section is for first-class passengers." Ethan inhaled deeply, reminding himself to stay calm. He had faced far worse than this during his deployments, far more intense hostility than the condescension of an entitled woman. Still, her words stung. The blatant disrespect she showed him without even knowing him was hard to swallow. "I haven't made a mistake," Ethan said firmly. "I have a first-class ticket, and this is my assigned seat." Claire pursed her lips, clearly unimpressed. She glanced around the lounge, as though searching for someone to validate her assumptions or come to her aid. When no one did, she exhaled an exaggerated sigh. "Well," she said, lowering her voice to a pointed whisper, "you'll have to forgive me for being skeptical. It's just not what I expected." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. He knew exactly what she meant. Her veiled words carried a weight he was all too familiar with, and though he had dealt with such assumptions before, it never got easier. Before he could respond, a flight attendant approached, sensing the tension. She gave both passengers a polite, if slightly nervous smile. "Is everything all right here?" the flight attendant asked cautiously, her eyes darting between them. Claire immediately straightened, her tone turning indignant. "I think there's been some kind of mistake." The flight attendant forced a polite smile and said, "I assure you, ma'am, everything is in order. Mr. Walker, if you'd like to take your seat, we'll be boarding shortly." Ethan Vive nodded, grateful for the intervention. He stepped forward, placed his bag in the overhead compartment, and settled into a seat next to Claire. She shifted uncomfortably, clearly displeased with how the situation had unfolded. Ethan felt a swirl of emotions as he adjusted in his seat, frustration, irritation, and a twinge of anger, but also a measure of relief. He had faced far worse than the prejudiced assumptions of one entitled woman, yet her attitude still stung. All he wanted was a peaceful flight, but the journey was already off to a turbulent start. Turning his gaze toward the window, Ethan tried to focus on the thought of home, of seeing his wife and daughter again. The image was a balm for his frayed nerves, but Claire's presence beside him was a persistent reminder of the biases that lingered in even the most mundane places. Ethan exhaled deeply, closed his eyes, and resolved to let it go. He had survived too much to let this moment ruin the peace he had been anticipating for months. Sitting quietly, he stared out at the runway, attempting to calm his mind. The brief interaction had unsettled him more than he wanted to admit, but he reminded himself that this was merely ignorance. It wasn't worth his energy to engage further. He had learned to choose his battles, and this was one he had no interest in fighting. Claire, however, seemed unwilling to move on. She kept stealing glances at Ethan from the corner of her eye, her lips pressed into a disapproving line. Every so often she would release a loud, exaggerated sigh, making her dissatisfaction with their seating arrangement abundantly clear. Finally, she could no longer hold back. Turning sharply toward Ethan, she said, "Are you sure you're supposed to be sitting here?" Her tone was sharp, almost accusatory, as if she were trying to catch him in some sort of lie. "I mean, this is first class." Ethan briefly glanced her way before returning his focus to the window. He wasn't interested in escalating the situation, but it was clear Claire wasn't going to let it rest. Yes, Ethan replied evenly, his voice calm but firm. I'm sure. Claire scoffed, her eyes narrowing. I don't know how you managed to get that seat, she muttered, almost to herself, but still loud enough for him to hear. There must have been some kind of mix-up. But Ethan's jaw tightened as he felt the tension in his chest build. He was aware of the other passengers now, their curious gazes discreetly watching the exchange. He didn't want to be the center of attention, and certainly didn't want to cause a scene. But Claire was pushing him to his limit. I didn't make a mistake, Ethan said, his tone measured but resolute. I bought this ticket. Claire crossed her arms, her expression a mix of disbelief and indignation. You bought a first-class ticket? She asked, incredulity dripping from her voice. I find that hard to believe. Ethan took another deep breath, holding back the words he truly wanted to say. He knew exactly what Claire was implying, even if she hadn't said it outright. The prejudice behind her disbelief hung heavily in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Believe what you want, Ethan said quietly, his patience wearing thin. But this is my seat. Claire huffed in frustration, clearly unsatisfied with his response. Turning toward the aisle, she waved down a flight attendant with exaggerated urgency. I need you to check this man's ticket, Claire demanded loudly, ensuring that everyone nearby could hear. There's been some sort of mistake. The flight attendant approached, her expression a mix of politeness and unease as she prepared to handle the unfolding situation. He doesn't belong in first class, Claire said sharply, her voice carrying across the cabin. The flight attendant, a young woman in her mid-20s, blinked in surprise, clearly taken aback by the accusation. She glanced at Ethan, her expression apologetic, before turning back to Claire. Ma'am, I've already checked his ticket, the attendant said, doing her best to remain professional despite the uncomfortable situation. Mr. Walker is in the correct seat. Well, I don't think that's right, Claire replied, her tone rising in pitch. There's no way he paid for a first-class seat. Ethan's grip tightened on the armrest, his knuckles going white, but he kept his composure. He knew who he was, and he wasn't about to let Claire's words diminish him. Still, the blatant disrespect stung. The flight attendant hesitated for a moment, her gaze flicking between Ethan and Claire. Ma'am, I assure you, everything is in order, she said, her voice firm yet polite. There's no mistake. But Claire wasn't satisfied. She shook her head, her voice growing colder and more insistent. You need to check again, she demanded. This man doesn't fit the profile of someone who flies first class. I don't know how he got this seat, but there's been some kind of mix-up, and I expect you to fix it. Ethan felt a flare of anger rise in his chest. The racial undertone that had been hinted at was now unmistakably out in the open, plain for everyone to hear. He glanced around the cabin, noting how the other passengers were reacting. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly embarrassed, while others seemed frozen, unsure of whether or how to intervene. To her credit, the flight attendant stayed composed. She turned to Ethan with a sympathetic smile. Sir, I'm so sorry for the inconvenience, she said gently. Could I please see your ticket again, just to confirm? Ethan sighed quietly, reaching into his pocket. He retrieved his boarding pass and handed it to her without a word, watching as she carefully examined it. A few moments later, she looked up and nodded. Everything is correct, she announced, her voice calm and confident. Turning back to Claire, she added, This is Mr. Walker's seat. Claire's face flushed red with irritation. Her mouth opened as if to argue further, but the flight attendant quickly cut her off, her tone now more authoritative. Ma'am, I need to ask you to stop harassing Mr. Walker, she said firmly. His ticket is valid, and he has every right to be in this seat. If there are any further issues, I will have to involve the captain. Claire's mouth snapped shut. Her eyes blazed with indignation, but after a tense moment, she seemed to decide against pressing the matter. With a loud huff, she crossed her arms and sank back into her seat, glaring at the seatback in front of her, as though it had personally offended her. Ethan exhaled a quiet breath, feeling the tension in the air start to dissipate. The flight attendant handed him back his ticket with a sympathetic smile. Thank you for your patience, sir, she said softly. I'm truly sorry for the inconvenience. It's not your fault, Ethan replied quietly, nodding in appreciation of her professionalism. The flight attendant gave him a small nod before turning and walking back down the aisle. Ethan watched her go, her posture rigid from the effort of keeping her composure. He felt a mix of relief and frustration. On the one hand, he was grateful the situation hadn't escalated further. On the other, Claire's words lingered in his mind, a bitter reminder of the prejudices that still existed in the world. He settled back into his seat, determined to focus on the positive. He was almost home. Soon, he'd be with his wife and daughter, and all of this would feel like a distant memory. All he had to do was make it through the next few hours. But Claire wasn't finished. Even though the flight attendant had clearly put her in her place, she couldn't seem to let go of her anger. She turned toward Ethan once more, her eyes narrowing as though she were gearing up for another confrontation. "You know, this whole thing is ridiculous." Claire muttered under her breath, her words loud enough for Ethan to hear. "I don't know why everyone's making such a big deal out of this. It's just a misunderstanding." Ethan didn't react. He had no desire to engage further. It was obvious that nothing he said would change Claire's mind. "I mean, it's not like I said anything that bad," she continued, her tone dripping with self-righteousness. "People are so sensitive these days, you can't say anything without someone getting offended." Ethan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. Responding would only escalate the situation, and he had no interest in drawing more attention to the tense scene. Instead, he focused on steadying his breathing, reminding himself that this was temporary. Soon, he'd be off the plane and far away from Claire's toxic presence. Claire, however, seemed to interpret his silence as encouragement to keep talking. "It's not like I was being rude," she said, her voice rising defensively. "I just asked a simple question. It's not my fault if people jump to conclusions." At last, Ethan turned to face her, his gaze firm and unyielding. "You didn't ask a question," he said quietly, his voice controlled but unmistakably sharp. "You made an assumption." Claire blinked, clearly caught off guard by his directness. For a moment she seemed unsure of how to respond. Then her expression hardened. "Well, excuse me for being surprised," she snapped. "I don't usually see." Ethan held up a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. "You don't need to explain," he said, his tone calm but firm. "I know exactly what you meant." Claire stared at him, her mouth slightly open, as if she couldn't believe he had dared to address her that way. For a moment, it looked like she might argue, but then she clamped her mouth shut, letting out an annoyed huff before turning away. Crossing her arms, she glared at the seat back in front of her, radiating frustration. Ethan shook his head and turned back to the window. He wasn't going to let her bait him into an argument. He'd encountered people like Claire before, those who masked their prejudice with veiled comments and condescending smiles. He had learned not to let their words cut deeper than they deserved. As the minutes passed, Ethan tried to focus on his thoughts, letting the excitement of seeing his family again distract him. But it was difficult to fully relax with Claire sitting so close, her hostility palpable. A few rows ahead, an older couple exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort with the situation written on their faces. A young man wearing earbuds kept his eyes glued to his phone, though his stiff posture suggested he was acutely aware of the tension. Other passengers shifted in their seats, casting furtive glances toward Ethan and Claire, unsure of how to react to what they had witnessed. Ethan knew this moment would linger in the minds of those around him. For some, it would be a stark reminder of how prejudice could manifest subtly, even in ordinary situations. For others, it would simply be an uncomfortable encounter they'd try to forget as soon as the plane landed. As the aircraft began to taxi down the runway, Ethan took one last deep breath, determined to leave the confrontation behind. The wheels lifted off the ground, and soon the plane was soaring into the sky, carrying him closer to the people who mattered most. But even as the city below faded into the distance, Claire's words hung heavy in the air, a weight Ethan couldn't entirely shake. The tense silence following their exchange settled over the first-class cabin like a dense fog. Claire, still visibly fuming, had turned her body slightly away from Ethan, as though his very presence offended her. She sat rigidly, arms crossed, occasionally shifting in her seat with a frustration that was evident in every movement. Ethan, however, had long stopped paying her any attention. Instead, he turned inward, focusing on the familiar mix of emotions her actions had stirred in him. Her words had cut deeper than he wanted to admit, resurfacing feelings he thought he had long since learned to manage. Years of service had taught him resilience, and he prided himself on his ability to maintain composure in the face of adversity. Yet moments like this, moments where his dignity was called into question for reasons beyond his control, still had the power to sting. Ethan reminded himself why he was here. Soon, he would be home. He'd hold his daughter in his arms and see his wife smile. He would leave this flight and Claire's ignorance far behind, letting it fade into the background of his life. For now, though, he focused on the rhythm of the plane's engines, the hum of steady progress carrying him closer to peace. Whatever hostility Claire continued to harbor was her burden to bear, not his. Ethan leaned his head against the seat and closed his eyes, finding solace in the knowledge that he was almost where he needed to be. Ethan leaned back in his seat, his eyes fixed on the small airplane window as the ground below grew more distant. The engines hummed steadily, their rhythmic sound oddly soothing in the wake of the confrontation that had unfolded. Little did Ethan or Claire know, a silent observer had been watching the entire scene unfold from just a few rows back. Seated inconspicuously in economy class, Aaron Foster was a well-known entrepreneur and philanthropist, his face familiar to anyone who kept up with business or charitable work. Despite wearing casual clothes for the flight, he carried an air of quiet authority, the kind of presence that came from years of experience, wisdom, and success. Aaron had boarded shortly after Claire and Ethan, slipping into his seat with little notice from the other passengers. As he settled in, he couldn't help but sense the growing tension a few rows ahead. Claire's haughty demeanor had been impossible to miss, and her escalating re-Ethans had drawn his attention. At first, Aaron had watched with mild curiosity, assuming it might be a simple misunderstanding. But as the exchange continued, his curiosity turned into disgust. The condescension in Claire's tone, the way she had openly questioned Ethan's place in first class, and the sheer entitlement in her insistence that the flight attendant verify his ticket, it all felt all too familiar. Aaron had encountered people like Claire many times before, individuals who carried their wealth or status like a shield, assuming it made them superior to others. It was a mindset he had spent years fighting against, both in his business endeavors and through his nonprofit work. As a philanthropist, Aaron had dedicated much of his career to addressing systemic inequality and promoting social justice. He believed deeply in using his influence to create change. Moments like this, however, reminded him just how far society still had to go. He had considered intervening, stepping in to call out Claire's behavior and offer Ethan the support he clearly deserved. But something held him back. It was Ethan's composure. Ethan had faced Claire's provocations with a quiet strength that spoke volumes. That kind of restraint, calm, unflinching dignity, was something Aaron had seen before in friends, colleagues, and even himself. It came from a lifetime of navigating a world where people made snap judgments before you even had a chance to speak. Aaron decided to remain silent for now, out of respect for Ethan's ability to handle the situation with grace. But he was far from indifferent. Watching Claire simmer in her seat, her lips pursed in frustration, only strengthened Aaron's resolve. This was not something he intended to let slide. As the boarding process continued, the tension in the cabin remained thick. Passengers were settling into their seats, but many cast uneasy glances toward the front, where Ethan and Claire sat. It was clear that several people had witnessed the confrontation, yet, like Aaron, they chose to stay silent. Some were uncomfortable, others simply unwilling to get involved. The unease was palpable, but no one dared to address it. Ethan, for his part, ignored the stares. He had been in similar situations before and knew how to endure them. Years in the military had taught him patience, resilience, and most importantly, the wisdom to pick his battles. This, as frustrating as it was, wasn't a fight worth engaging in. Ethan had nothing to prove to Claire or anyone else in that cabin. He knew his worth, knew the sacrifices he had made, and he wasn't about to let her ignorance shake his confidence. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, Ethan leaned his head against the seat and let his thoughts drift. It was hard not to reflect on his time in the military, given the irony of the situation. In the service, he had worked alongside people from every walk of life, united by a shared mission. In that world, respect wasn't earned by wealth or privilege. It was earned by action, by your character, and by the way you treated others. The stark contrast to what he had just experienced with Claire was a bitter reminder of the work still left to be done in the world outside the military. Meanwhile, Aaron continued to observe silently. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was a moment that called for action. Not just for Ethan, but for the countless others who faced similar discrimination daily. He didn't know exactly how, but Aaron resolved to find a way to address what he had witnessed. He believed in creating opportunities for people like Ethan to rise above these moments and in holding individuals like Claire accountable for their actions. For now, he remained in his seat, his mind turning over possibilities. Aaron had learned long ago that timing was everything, and he knew there would be a right moment to act. As the flight continued, the hum of the engines filled the cabin, a stark contrast to the lingering tension. Ethan closed his eyes, focusing on the thought of home. He had fought for his peace, and he wasn't about to let someone like Claire take it away. Aaron, meanwhile, leaned back in his seat, his determination quietly growing. Little did Ethan know, the silent observer a few rows behind him was already planning the next step in what would become an unexpected journey for them both. Yet, despite his service, despite the medals and commendations he had earned, he was still seen as less than by some, solely because of the color of his skin. It wasn't a new feeling. Ethan had grown up facing discrimination. Even as he climbed the ranks in the military, where he had proven himself time and again, there were moments when his worth was questioned or diminished because of his race. But he had learned to rise above it, focusing on what truly mattered: his family, his comrades, and the values he held close to his heart. He hadn't fought for his country because he believed it was flawless. He had fought because he believed in its potential to be better. As Ethan sat staring out the window at the vast expanse of sky, a wave of frustration washed over him. How many more times would he have to prove himself? How many more moments like this would he have to endure? He had given so much: his time, his energy, even his safety, for a country that, in so many ways, still refused to see him as equal. But then his thoughts turned to his family, his wife, who had stood by him through every deployment, and his daughter, who had grown up too quickly in his absence. They were his anchors, the reason he pushed through every challenge and moment of doubt. Soon, he would be home with them, and that thought alone made all of this worth it. Ethan shifted in his seat, casting a brief glance at Claire. She was still fuming silently, her arms crossed and her body rigid. Since the flight attendant had confirmed Ethan's rightful place, Claire hadn't spoken another word to him. Yet her posture screamed volumes. She hadn't let go of her resentment, but Ethan was done engaging with her. Let her stew. He wouldn't allow her to ruin this moment, this flight that marked the final leg of his journey home. A few rows back, Aaron observed quietly, reflecting on the confrontation. He had seen similar situations play out countless times, even in spaces meant to be inclusive and progressive. Moments like these were stark reminders of the deeply rooted biases that still lingered, even when society claimed progress had been made. But Aaron wasn't the type to sit idly by. He had spent his career fighting for change, both in his business ventures and philanthropic work, and he wasn't about to let this moment slip away without doing something. What struck Aaron most was Ethan's quiet strength. Ethan hadn't let Claire's venomous words diminish him. He had met her hostility with dignity and grace, qualities Aaron deeply admired. For Aaron, people like Ethan embodied resilience and integrity, and he believed in supporting those who lived by such values. As the flight attendants began moving through the cabin, offering drinks and snacks, Aaron made a decision. He didn't yet know what he would do, but he knew he couldn't ignore what had happened. The moment called for acknowledgement and action. For now, though, Aaron chose to remain silent. He had learned long ago that timing was everything, and there would be a right moment to step forward. Ethan deserved his peace, and Aaron was determined to respect that. Meanwhile, Ethan's thoughts drifted once more to his military service. He thought about the missions he had completed and the people he had served alongside. They had been a diverse group, united by a shared sense of purpose and a bond forged in some of the most dangerous situations imaginable. In that world, loyalty, trust, and the ability to do your job had mattered far more than skin color or background. Race had rarely come up because what truly mattered was who you were and how you treated those around you. The contrast with the outside world couldn't have been starker. Here, people like Claire felt entitled to judge him without knowing a single thing about him. Yet, Ethan believed change was possible. He had seen it in small, everyday moments where understanding and compassion replaced ignorance and prejudice. Those glimpses of progress, though sometimes fleeting, were enough to give him hope. As the flight continued, Ethan let himself relax slightly. He focused on the hum of the engines and the thought of home, allowing those comforting images to wash over him. For now, he chose to let the incident fade, a momentary hurdle in his otherwise meaningful journey. Unbeknownst to Ethan, Aaron was still watching, his mind working through the possibilities of how he might turn this moment into something greater. Little did they both know, the encounter was about to set off a chain of events that would impact their lives, and the lives of many others, in ways neither of them could have anticipated. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't let people like Claire hold him back. He had fought too hard and sacrificed too much to be diminished by her narrow-mindedness. Aaron Foster, the philanthropist, kept his gaze fixed on the back of Claire's seat, his mind busy. He had seen enough and was ready to act. The flight might have seemed uneventful to some, but beneath the surface, something significant was brewing, something neither Ethan nor Claire could have anticipated. The plane's wheels touched down on the tarmac with a soft thud, the engines shifting pitch as they prepared for taxiing. For most passengers, the end of the flight brought a palpable sense of relief. For Ethan, however, it marked the conclusion of an experience he would not soon forget. Throughout the ordeal, Ethan had maintained his calm and dignity in the face of Claire's arrogance. But as the plane began to slow, the exhaustion of the past few hours caught up with him. He stretched slightly in his seat, trying to ease the tension in his shoulders. It had been a long deployment, and all he wanted now was to reunite with his family. He pictured his wife's smile, and the way his daughter would run to greet him with outstretched arms. The thought made the remaining minutes of waiting even more difficult to bear. Across the aisle, Claire was gathering her belongings, her posture rigid and her face still fixed in that same mask of superiority. She hadn't spoken a word to Ethan since the flight attendant had confirmed his rightful place in first class. To Claire, his calmness was likely interpreted as submission. She had neither apologized nor acknowledged her mistake, seemingly convinced she had come out on top. As the other passengers stood and began retrieving their luggage from the overhead bins, Claire shot Ethan one last disdainful glance before turning her back on him completely. She had no idea who she had shared the row with, no clue that the man she had dismissed was a decorated soldier who had given years of his life in service to his country. But to Claire, none of that mattered. She remained blind to the person Ethan was, content to judge him based solely on surface assumptions. Ethan, however, had already moved on. He stood and retrieved his carry-on bag, giving the cabin one last glance. Many of the passengers who had witnessed the earlier confrontation seemed eager to disembark, avoiding eye contact as they filed out. The tension in the air was still noticeable, though no one wanted to acknowledge it. Ethan felt the weight of their stares, but paid them no mind. His thoughts were already elsewhere, on his family, on home, and on the conclusion of this long and arduous journey. As he stepped into the terminal, the cool air of the airport hit him, and for the first time in hours, Ethan allowed himself to breathe a little easier. He was almost there, almost home. But just as he began walking toward the exit, something unexpected happened. A voice called out from behind him, firm but polite. "Excuse me, sir, Ethan, isn't it?" Ethan turned to see a man approaching him. Dressed in casual clothes, the man carried an air of quiet confidence that immediately set him apart. His posture and demeanor suggested authority, though he lacked any trace of arrogance. Ethan didn't immediately recognize the man approaching him. But as he drew closer, realization struck. This was the passenger who had been seated a few rows back on the plane, the silent observer during the tense exchange with Claire. "Yes," Ethan said cautiously. "Can I help you?" The man offered a polite smile and extended his hand. "Aaron Foster," he said. Ethan shook the man's hand, still unsure where this was going. The name tugged at his memory, but he couldn't quite place it. "I was on the flight with you," Aaron explained, his tone calm but deliberate. "I saw what happened with that woman, Claire, was it?" Ethan nodded, his expression neutral. "Yeah, I remember." Aaron hesitated for a moment, as though carefully considering his next words. "I just wanted to say, I was really impressed by how you handled yourself. The grace you showed in that situation, it says a lot about your character. Most people would have lost their temper." Ethan shrugged slightly, deflecting the compliment. "I've dealt with worse," he replied. "It's not worth the energy." Aaron's expression softened, a look of understanding crossing his face. "I can imagine you have," he said, "but that doesn't take away from how much it mattered. What you did, how you handled yourself, it stood out to me, and I'm sure it did to others as well." Ethan wasn't used to receiving such direct praise, especially from a stranger. He shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. "I appreciate that," he said after a pause. "But honestly, it was nothing." "No, it wasn't nothing," Aaron countered, his tone firm. "And I'd like to talk to you about something, if you have a moment." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Aaron gestured for him to walk with him. "Let me explain," he said, leading Ethan toward a quieter section of the terminal. Curious but cautious, Ethan followed. "I run a non-profit organization," Aaron began as they walked. "We focus on supporting veterans and helping minority-owned businesses thrive. Watching you back there, I couldn't help but think you'd be a perfect fit for a role we're looking to fill. It's something I'd love to discuss with you." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. He had expected a quick exchange, perhaps a polite thank you from someone who had witnessed the incident, but this was entirely different. "What kind of role are we talking about?" Ethan asked, his tone measured but intrigued. Aaron smiled as they reached a quieter area, away from the hustle of the terminal. "We're always searching for strong leaders," he said. "People who can inspire others, who have the resilience and dignity to guide our mission. You showed all of that back on the plane. You didn't let her words shake you. That's exactly the kind of strength we need." Ethan listened, his curiosity growing. "I've done my time in the military," Ethan said after a moment. "Honestly, I was planning to take a break, spend more time focusing on my family." "I completely respect that," Aaron replied quickly. "But this wouldn't have to be full-time. It's something you could do on your own terms, and the impact you could have, it would be significant." Ethan considered the offer, still processing the unexpected turn of events. The idea of working with an organization that supported veterans and minority-owned businesses resonated with him. It was something he had thought about often, finding a way to continue serving, albeit in a different capacity. But it was all so sudden, so out of the blue. Just hours earlier, he had been focused solely on getting home and putting the incident with Claire behind him. Now it seemed that moment was opening a door he hadn't anticipated. "What kind of impact are we talking about?" Ethan asked after a pause, his curiosity overcoming his hesitation. Aaron's eyes lit up. "We're working on a few major initiatives right now. One of the biggest is a mentorship program for veterans transitioning to civilian life. You'd be guiding them, helping them find their footing, and sharing your own experiences. We're also expanding our grants program for minority-owned businesses, giving them the support they need to launch or grow. The work you'd be doing would directly change lives." Ethan nodded slowly, his mind racing with possibilities. This wasn't just an offer. It felt like an opportunity to do something meaningful, something aligned with the values he had carried with him throughout his military career. He had always wanted to find a way to make a difference after the military, but he hadn't expected the chance to come like this at this moment. Perhaps, though, that was the point. "It's a lot to think about," Ethan admitted. "I understand," Aaron said, his tone encouraging. "No pressure. Take some time to think it over. But if you're interested, I'd love to show you what we're working on." Ethan nodded. "I'll give it some thought." Aaron must have sensed Ethan's hesitation, because he added, Look, I'm not expecting you to decide right now. But how about this? Come to a meeting with the team tomorrow just to see what we're working on. No pressure. I think you'll be impressed. Ethan studied Aaron for a moment, still uncertain, but there was a growing curiosity stirring within him. A meeting, huh? Aaron grinned. Yeah, we're based not far from here. Come by tomorrow. Check it out for yourself. Ethan considered it for a long moment, weighing the unexpected offer. Finally, he nodded. All right, I'll stop by. The two men shook hands again, and as they did, Ethan felt a flicker of purpose he hadn't experienced in a while. This didn't feel like a random encounter. It felt like the beginning of something significant. As Ethan walked away, heading toward the terminal exit and the reunion he had been longing for, he couldn't help but feel grateful for the unexpected turn his journey had taken. The next day, Ethan arrived at the address Aaron had given him, a modest but professional-looking building nestled in a busy part of the city. He wasn't sure what to expect, but as he stepped through the doors, he was greeted by an immediate sense of warmth and purpose. The walls were adorned with photos of veterans and their families, alongside snapshots of smiling entrepreneurs cutting ribbons in front of new businesses. The space radiated a quiet pride in its mission. Aaron met him at the entrance, his easygoing smile the same as it had been the day before. Glad you made it, he said, ushering Ethan inside. He led him through the building to a conference room where a small group of team members were already seated. As the meeting began, Ethan listened intently while Aaron and the others outlined the organization's projects. They were working on mentorship programs for veterans, providing transition support as they re-entered civilian life. They also offered grants and resources for minority-owned businesses, helping them grow and thrive. With each detail shared, Ethan found himself becoming more invested. The work was meaningful, tangible, and deeply needed. It was exactly the kind of impact he had hoped to make after leaving the military, even if he hadn't quite known how to begin. When the meeting ended, Aaron turned to Ethan, his expression hopeful. So, what do you think? Ethan smiled, feeling more certain than he had in a long time. I'm in. In the weeks that followed, Ethan embraced his new role with the organization. Drawing on his experience and leadership skills, he worked to guide veterans through their transitions and support the growth of minority-owned businesses. The work was challenging, but deeply rewarding, and for the first time in a while, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. Meanwhile, Claire remained blissfully unaware of the ripple effects her actions on the plane had set in motion. She had walked away from the incident believing she had emerged victorious, never realizing that her behavior had only strengthened Ethan's resolve to make a difference. Ethan, on the other hand, was thriving. No matter how people like Claire tried to tear him down, he knew he would always rise above. Little did Ethan or Claire know, however, that their encounter was about to take on a life of its own. Unbeknownst to both of them, a fellow passenger had discreetly recorded their confrontation on a smartphone. The video captured Claire's condescending remarks and Ethan's calm, dignified response in stark contrast. The passenger, a college student named Mia, had been seated a few rows behind them. Initially hesitant to get involved, Mia had felt compelled to document the exchange, sensing its significance. After deliberating for a day, she decided to share the video online, hoping it would spark a meaningful conversation about prejudice in everyday situations. Within hours, the video went viral. It spread like wildfire across social media, garnering millions of views and sparking heated discussions. The hashtag #FirstClassBias began trending, with people from all walks of life weighing in on the incident. Comments poured in overwhelmingly in support of Ethan. This man's grace under pressure is inspiring. True strength right there. How can people still act like this in 2024? Absolutely disgusting behavior. That woman's arrogance is appalling. I hope the airline bans her for life. As the video continued to spread, it caught the attention of major news outlets. Soon, the story was being discussed on national broadcasts, with anchors and commentators dissecting its implications for modern society. One news anchor introduced the segment with somber gravity. A shocking display of prejudice aboard a first-class flight has ignited a nationwide conversation about privilege and discrimination. The now viral video shows a woman, identified as Claire Whitman, questioning a man's right to sit in first class solely based on his appearance. The video has been viewed over 10 million times, sparking outrage across the country. The public's reaction was swift and unrelenting. Outraged by Claire's behavior, many called for consequences. It didn't take long for online sleuths to identify her and her employer, a prominent marketing firm based in Chicago. As the backlash intensified, the marketing firm found itself at the center of a public relations nightmare. Their social media accounts were inundated with angry comments demanding action and accountability. The company's CEO, Ellen Porter, quickly grasped the severity of the situation. During an emergency meeting with her executive team, Ellen paced the room, her face etched with concern. "We need to address this immediately," she said firmly. "Our silence is being taken as complicity." One executive hesitated. "Maybe we should wait for the storm to die down. These things usually blow over in a few days." Ellen shook her head decisively. "No, we can't afford to wait. Our company values explicitly state our commitment to diversity and inclusion. If we don't act now, we're hypocrites." After a heated discussion, the decision was made. Ellen drafted a public statement condemning Claire's actions and announcing her immediate termination from the company. The statement read, "We at Porter Marketing are deeply disturbed by the video circulating online, which features one of our employees. The behavior displayed goes against everything our company stands for. We have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind." Effective immediately, Claire Whitman is no longer employed by our organization. As news of Claire's termination spread, the public's reaction was divided. Many applauded the company for its swift response, praising their commitment to upholding ethical values. Others debated whether the punishment fit the offense, raising questions about accountability in the age of social media and the boundaries of an employer's oversight on personal behavior. Claire, who had been blissfully unaware of the growing storm around her, was blindsided by her sudden termination. She arrived at work one morning to find her access card deactivated and security waiting to escort her from the premises. In a state of shock, Claire tried to plead her case to her colleagues. "This is all a misunderstanding," she exclaimed, her voice shrill with panic. "They're blowing it out of proportion. It wasn't like that." But her desperate pleas fell on deaf ears. As she was escorted out of the building, the reality of her situation began to sink in. The comfortable life she had enjoyed was unraveling, all because of a moment of prejudice caught on camera, too. In the days that followed, Claire's life became a whirlwind of public scrutiny and personal crisis. She was recognized on the street, with people hurling insults and accusing her of being a racist. Her social media accounts were inundated with angry messages, forcing her to deactivate them. Friends and acquaintances began to distance themselves, wary of being associated with her. What had seemed like a fleeting moment of entitlement on a flight had now spiraled into a life-altering event. Claire was left to grapple with the consequences of her actions, her once secure world crumbling around her. Meanwhile, the video continued to spark important conversations about privilege, discrimination, and the power of accountability in a connected world. Though Claire's fall was steep and sudden, the dialogue her actions had inadvertently ignited carried the potential for broader understanding and change. Even her closest friends and family began to distance themselves, wary of being associated with the controversy. Desperate to repair her crumbling reputation, Claire agreed to an interview with a local news station. Her usual confidence was conspicuously absent, replaced by nervous energy. "Miss Whitman," the interviewer began, her tone firm but professional, "what do you have to say about your actions on that flight?" Claire shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her voice faltering as she replied, I realize now that my behavior was inappropriate, but I want people to understand, I'm not a racist. It was just a misunderstanding." The interviewer wasn't satisfied and pressed further. "But the video clearly shows you questioning the gentleman's right to be in first class based on his appearance. How do you explain that? How is that not racist?" Claire's carefully maintained facade began to crack. "I was tired. I wasn't thinking clearly," she stammered. "I've never had any issues with people of color before. I have black friends." Her weak attempts at justification only added fuel to the fire. Social media exploded with memes and parodies of the interview, further cementing Claire's status as a symbol of entitled prejudice. While Claire was grappling with the fallout of her actions, Ethan's story was unfolding in a vastly different direction. The same video that had exposed Claire's bias had also highlighted Ethan's remarkable composure and dignity. Aaron Foster, recognizing an opportunity to amplify a powerful message, approached Ethan with an idea: to make him the face of the organization's new anti-discrimination campaign. Together, they launched a series of videos featuring Ethan sharing his story and emphasizing the importance of respect and equality. In one of the most impactful videos, Ethan addressed the audience directly, his tone steady and sincere. "What happened to me on that flight isn't unique," he said. "People of color face these kinds of microaggressions every day. But we have a choice. We can let these moments break us down, or we can use them as fuel to drive change." The campaign resonated deeply, spreading across the country like wildfire. Ethan's message of resilience and hope struck a chord with countless individuals who had experienced similar struggles. Donations to Aaron's nonprofit organization surged, allowing them to expand their initiatives. The funds helped the charity reach more veterans, provide greater support to minority-owned businesses, and broaden its efforts to combat systemic inequities. As the campaign gained momentum, Ethan found himself thrust into the national spotlight. He was invited to speak at conferences and events across the country, his story inspiring audiences everywhere. At first, Ethan was hesitant. He had never sought the limelight and preferred to focus on the work itself, rather than his newfound fame. But as he saw the impact of his words and the changes they were inspiring, he realized the potential of his platform to make a real difference. During one particularly memorable speech at a national conference on racial equity, Ethan stood before a packed auditorium. The room fell silent as he spoke, his voice strong and unwavering. "The incident on that plane was just one moment," he began, "but it represents a much larger issue in our society. We need to have honest conversations about race and privilege. We need to challenge our biases and stand up against discrimination wherever we see it." When he finished, the crowd erupted into applause, many rising to their feet in a standing ovation. Ethan's words were having a tangible impact, inspiring people to reflect on their own behaviors and work toward creating a more inclusive society. As Ethan's influence grew, so did the reach of Aaron's nonprofit. They formed partnerships with major corporations to implement diversity and inclusion training programs. Grants for minority-owned businesses were expanded, creating jobs and stimulating economic growth in underserved communities. The organization's veteran support programs flourished as well, providing essential resources and mentorship to those transitioning to civilian life. One day, as Ethan was leaving a meeting at the nonprofit's office, he ran into Aaron in the hallway. Aaron clapped him on the shoulder, his expression one of pride and gratitude. "You know, Ethan," Aaron said, "when I saw you on that plane, I knew you had something special. But even I couldn't have imagined the impact you'd have." Ethan smiled humbly, his mind racing with thoughts of how far they had come. "I just hope we're making a difference," he replied. Aaron nodded. "You're doing more than that. You're inspiring people to believe in the possibility of change. That's more powerful than you realize." Ethan couldn't help but reflect on the unexpected path his journey had taken. What had started as a deeply frustrating encounter had transformed into an opportunity to create real, lasting change. As he left the office that day, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, ready to continue the work that had become so much more than just a job. It had become a mission. As they walked together toward the building's exit, Aaron chuckled softly. "You know, in a strange way, we almost owe Claire a thank you," he said. "Her actions that day set all of this in motion." Ethan shook his head, his expression growing thoughtful. "I don't think we owe her anything," he said, his tone measured. "But I do hope she's learned something from all this. Maybe, in some small way, this whole experience has opened her eyes." They stepped out into the sunlight, and Ethan couldn't help but reflect on the unexpected journey that had brought him to this point. From an act of prejudice on a plane to becoming a voice for change, his life had taken a turn he never could have anticipated. As he glanced back at the nonprofit's building behind him, its motto emblazoned across the entrance, empowering change, embracing diversity, he felt a profound sense of purpose. He was exactly where he was meant to be. The incident that had started it all, a fleeting moment of bias caught on camera, had sparked a national conversation. Claire's actions had cost her not only her job but her reputation, serving as a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked prejudice. But that same moment had also elevated Ethan, turning him into a symbol of resilience and grace under pressure. He had become a catalyst for positive change, inspiring countless others to confront their own biases and take action against discrimination. As Ethan drove home that evening, he thought about the lives touched by the organization's work. Veterans were finding stability as they transitioned into civilian life. Minority entrepreneurs were receiving the support they needed to thrive. And across the country, people were engaging in important conversations about equality and justice. He couldn't help but smile at the irony. Claire's attempt to diminish him had instead propelled him into a position where he could truly make a difference. It was a powerful reminder that life's most challenging moments often led to the most unexpected and rewarding opportunities. When he pulled into his driveway, Ethan's smile widened at the sight of his wife and daughter waiting on the porch. Their faces lit up as he stepped out of the car, and he was reminded once again of what truly mattered: family, purpose, and the chance to leave the world better than he had found it. The public backlash against Claire, combined with Ethan's rise as a leader and advocate, had created a ripple effect that stretched far beyond the confines of that first-class cabin. The video had sparked a national conversation about race, privilege, and accountability, leading to both consequences and new opportunities for everyone involved. For Ethan, life had settled into a new rhythm. His work with Aaron's nonprofit had become more than just a job. It was a calling. Each day brought its own challenges and rewards as the organization's reach and impact grew. On this particular morning, Ethan found himself preparing for a meeting with a potential corporate sponsor, a Fortune 500 company interested in partnering with the nonprofit on a nationwide diversity initiative. Adjusting his tie in the mirror, Ethan caught sight of the framed newspaper article hanging on his office wall. The bold headline read, "From First-Class Confrontation to First-Class Citizen, Ethan Warner's Journey." He shook his head slightly, still amazed at how a single moment of adversity had sparked such profound change. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. It was Aaron, looking energized and ready. "Ethan, are you good to go? The CEO of Kingston Dynamics is waiting in the conference room," he said with an excited grin. Ethan nodded, taking a steadying breath. "Let's do this." As they walked toward the conference room, Aaron filled Ethan in. Kingston Dynamics has been under increasing pressure to improve their diversity and inclusion practices. They're hoping a partnership with us will help them make some meaningful changes. Entering the room, Ethan was met with a surprising sight: a familiar face. Emily Harper, the former CEO of the marketing firm that had fired Claire, stood to greet them. She extended her hand warmly, her smile genuine. "Mr. Walker, it's an honor to meet you," Emily said, her tone sincere. "Your story has been an inspiration to so many, myself included." Ethan shook her hand, surprised by the connection. "Miss Harper, I believe we share a mutual acquaintance," he said, his voice measured. Emily's smile faltered slightly, but she nodded. "Yes, we do," she admitted. The incident with Claire was a wake-up call, not just for her but for our entire organization. It made us realize we needed to go beyond just talking about diversity and inclusion. We had to truly live it. As they sat down, Emily explained that she had left her role at the marketing firm and taken on the position of Chief Diversity Officer at Kingston Dynamics. "Your story, Ethan," she continued, "made me reflect deeply. I realized I wanted to be part of the solution, to be proactive, not just reactive when it comes to these issues." The meeting progressed with Emily outlining Kingston Dynamics' plans for a comprehensive diversity and inclusion program. They wanted to partner with Aaron's nonprofit to provide training, mentorship, and support for minority employees and entrepreneurs. As Ethan listened, he couldn't help but marvel at the chain of events that had led to this moment. The same woman whose company had fired Claire after her prejudice went viral was now sitting across from him, seeking his expertise on fostering a more inclusive workplace. It was a powerful reminder of how a single moment could create ripples of change. After the meeting concluded and Emily was preparing to leave, she paused at the door. "Mr. Walker, there's something else I wanted to discuss with you," she said, her tone shifting to something more serious. Ethan felt a twinge of unease. He hadn't thought about Claire in months, deliberately avoiding updates on her life after the initial media frenzy. "What about her?" he asked cautiously. Emily sighed, her expression tinged with concern. "She's been struggling to find work since the incident. That video, it's followed her everywhere. I recently heard she's working minimum wage jobs just to scrape by. She's barely managing." Ethan listened, uncertain how to feel. Part of him felt a flicker of sympathy for Claire, despite everything. But another part reminded him of the humiliation and pain he'd experienced that day on the plane. "She made her bed," Ethan said after a pause, his voice calm but firm. Emily nodded. "I know. What she did was wrong, completely inexcusable. But I can't help wondering, is there a way to turn even this into something positive? What if there's an opportunity here to show what true growth and forgiveness look like?" Ethan raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "What are you suggesting?" "What if we offer Claire a chance to make amends?" Emily proposed. "Not just a public apology, but a real opportunity to learn and change. She could go through the diversity training program we're building and maybe even share her story as a cautionary tale. It could be powerful to show that people can grow from their mistakes, that cancel culture doesn't have to be the final chapter." Emily paused, studying Ethan's expression. "It's a bold idea," she admitted, "but it aligns with the very work you're doing, helping people confront their biases and grow from them." Ethan leaned back in his chair, at processing the suggestion. It was a risky proposition, no doubt, but wasn't that the heart of their mission? To challenge individuals to reflect, to grow, and to take responsibility? "Let me think about it," Ethan said finally. "It's not a decision I'll make lightly." Emily nodded, understanding the weight of what she was asking. "Thank you," she said. "Whatever you decide, I trust it will come from a place of thoughtfulness." As Emily left the room, Ethan turned to Aaron, who had been silent during the exchange. "What do you think?" Ethan asked Aaron, who leaned back and stroked his chin thoughtfully. "It's risky," Aaron admitted. "But if it works, it could be transformative, not just for Claire, but for everyone who sees it. It's easy to write someone off as a lost cause. It's much harder, and far more meaningful, to offer them a path to redemption." Ethan spent the next few days wrestling with the decision. He discussed it with his wife, seeking her wisdom and perspective. She reminded him of the values that had guided him throughout his life and career: compassion, forgiveness, and the belief in people's capacity to grow and change. Finally, Ethan made his decision. He called Emily to agree to the plan, but with conditions. "Claire has to fully commit to the program," he told her. "Not just a one-time training or a token effort. She needs to show real change, not just talk about it. And most importantly, she has to agree to use her story to educate others about the harm caused by prejudice and discrimination." Emily was overjoyed. "Thank you, Ethan," she said sincerely. "I believe this could truly be the start of something transformative." The next step was reaching out to Claire. Emily volunteered to take on this task, tracking her down to the small apartment where she now lived. The Claire Emily found was a shadow of the confident, entitled woman from the plane. Months of public scrutiny and professional rejection had left her visibly worn down. When Emily explained the proposal, Claire was immediately skeptical, even hostile. "Why would you want to help me?" she demanded, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Is this some kind of trick to humiliate me even more?" Emily shook her head calmly. "No, Claire. This is a genuine offer. A chance to make things right, to learn and grow from your mistakes. But it won't be easy. You'll have to face some hard truths about yourself and your actions." Claire was silent for a long time, her defenses beginning to crack. Tears welled in her eyes as she finally whispered, "I've lost everything. My job, my friends, my reputation. All because of one stupid moment. I never thought of myself as prejudiced, but now, I don't even know who I am anymore." Emily placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. That's a start, she said gently. Recognizing that we all have biases, that we all have room to grow, that's the first step. The question is, are you willing to take the next one? After a long pause, Claire nodded slowly. Yes, she said, her voice barely audible. Yes, I am. Over the following months, Claire embarked on an intensive education program. She attended workshops, read extensively, and engaged in challenging conversations about race, privilege, and unconscious bias. The process was grueling. There were moments of defensiveness and times when she slipped into old patterns of thinking. But little by little, Claire began to change. She became more self-aware, more empathetic, and more willing to confront the uncomfortable truths about herself and the world around her. The culmination of the program was a face-to-face meeting with Ethan. Both of them were understandably nervous as they sat down in a neutral conference room at Kingston Dynamics. Claire spoke first, her voice trembling but resolute. Ethan, I don't even know where to begin. What I did to you that day was inexcusable. I was arrogant, prejudiced, and cruel. I'm deeply, deeply sorry. Ethan listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When Claire finished, he leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. I appreciate your apology, he said. But I need to know, what have you learned from this experience? How have you changed? Claire took a deep breath. I've learned so much, she began. I've learned about the microaggressions that people of color face every day. I've realized my own privilege and how I've benefited from systemic racism without even noticing. Most importantly, I've learned that it's not enough to just say I'm not racist. We have to be actively anti-racist. That means challenging our own biases and standing up against discrimination wherever we see it. As Claire spoke, Ethan could see the genuine change in her. The entitled woman from the plane was gone, replaced by someone humbled, reflective, and eager to grow. It wasn't perfect. There were still traces of her old self, moments when her ingrained biases peeked through. But the transformation was undeniable. Ethan nodded slowly when she finished. Change is a journey, he said, and it seems like you're finally on the right path. The entitled woman from the plane had been replaced by someone humbled, reflective, and eager to learn. Claire's transformation wasn't without flaws. There were still occasional moments when her old biases surfaced, but the change in her was undeniable. Thank you, Claire, Ethan said when she finished speaking. It's clear you've put in a lot of effort to grow. But you know this isn't the end, right? This is just the beginning of a lifelong journey. Claire nodded, her expression serious. I know, she replied, and I'm committed, not just for myself, but to help others learn from my mistakes. In the weeks that followed, Ethan and Claire collaborated to create a new diversity program for Kingston Dynamics and Aaron's nonprofit. Together, they crafted a presentation that included their story, the incident on the plane, the fallout, and the growth and reconciliation that followed. Their first joint presentation was nerve-wracking for both of them. Standing in front of a room filled with Kingston Dynamics employees, they took turns recounting their experiences. Claire spoke first, her voice steady despite the nerves she clearly felt. A year ago, I was a very different person, she began. I thought of myself as open-minded, as a good person, but one moment on a plane exposed the uncomfortable truth about my biases. As she described the incident, many in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided eye contact, perhaps recognizing parts of themselves in her story. Then Ethan took his turn. He spoke candidly about the pain of being judged and dismissed based on his appearance, the wariness of constantly having to prove his worth in spaces like first class. But he also highlighted the power of resilience and the ability to turn adversity into an opportunity for growth. What happened that day hurt, Ethan said, his voice strong and measured. But it also sparked something powerful. It started conversations, ignited change, and reminded us all that even in our darkest moments, there's room for growth and redemption. When they concluded, the room erupted into applause. Many employees approached them afterward, sharing their own experiences and pledging to reflect on their own biases and do better. Over time, Ethan and Claire's story extended far beyond Kingston Dynamics. They were invited to speak at conferences, universities, and corporations. Their journey, from conflict to growth to reconciliation, became a powerful teaching tool, helping others confront uncomfortable truths about racism, privilege, and the capacity for change. One evening, after delivering a particularly impactful presentation, Ethan and Claire found themselves sitting in a quiet corner of a hotel bar, reflecting on how far they had come. "You know," Claire said, swirling her glass of water thoughtfully, "a part of me will always feel ashamed of what I did that day. But at the same time, I'm grateful for where it led me. I'm a better person now than I ever was before." Ethan nodded, understanding the complex emotions she described. "That's the thing about growth," he said. "It's often painful, but it's always worth it." Claire gave him a small smile, tinged with both gratitude and regret. "I just wish it hadn't taken such public humiliation for me to learn these lessons." "Maybe that's part of your purpose now," Ethan suggested gently, "to help others learn these lessons without having to go through what you did." As they continued their conversation, a young woman approached their table hesitantly. Her voice wavered as she spoke. "Excuse me," she said, clearly nervous. "I saw your presentation earlier. I wanted to thank you both. It made me realize some things about myself that I'm not proud of. But it also gave me hope that I can change." Ethan and Claire exchanged a glance, both feeling a deep sense of validation. This was why they did this work, to spark moments of self-reflection and inspire change. As the young woman walked away, Claire turned back to Ethan. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that student hadn't recorded the video?" she asked. "If none of this had ever come to light?" Ethan considered the question for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Ethan said thoughtfully, "But I like to believe everything happens for a reason. Maybe we needed to go through all this to get where we are now." Claire nodded, her expression contemplative. "You know, when this all began, I thought my life was over. I never imagined I'd end up here, doing this work. It's funny how life turns out sometimes." "It is," Ethan agreed with a small smile. "But that's the beauty of it, isn't it? We never know where our actions might lead. All we can do is make the best choices, learn from our mistakes, and keep moving forward." As they sat together in the quiet bar, the unlikely duo, brought together by a moment of conflict, felt a profound sense of purpose. What had started as a painful incident had been transformed into a force for meaningful change. The road wasn't always smooth. There were still moments of discomfort and tension, but they had learned to embrace those moments. They understood that growth often came from discomfort, and they were committed to the journey ahead. What had once been a viral video or a cautionary tale had evolved into something much greater, a testament to the power of education, empathy, and the resilience of the human spirit. In a world too often divided by race and privilege, Ethan and Claire's story offered a glimmer of hope, a reminder that even in the face of prejudice and discrimination, there is always the potential for learning, transformation, and reconciliation. When they left the bar that evening, stepping into the crisp night air, Ethan and Claire carried a sense of optimism. They had come so far from the day on the plane, yet they knew their journey was far from over. There were still stories to tell, minds to open, and hearts to change. As they parted ways, heading to their respective hotel rooms, they were buoyed by the knowledge that their unlikely partnership was making a real difference. One presentation, one conversation at a time. Later that night, Ethan lay in bed, reflecting on the strange twists his life had taken. From a decorated veteran to a victim of public discrimination to a symbol of growth and advocacy, it had been a remarkable journey. He thought about the young woman who had approached them in the bar earlier and the countless others who had shared similar revelations after hearing their story. It was a powerful reminder of why this work mattered so deeply. Across town, Claire stood in front of the mirror in her own hotel room. She barely recognized the person looking back at her, not just in appearance, but in spirit. The entitled woman she had once been felt like a distant memory. Her journey of self-reflection and growth had been challenging, even painful, but she wouldn't trade it for anything. As Ethan and Claire drifted off to sleep, they both felt a renewed sense of purpose and hope. They understood that the work ahead would be demanding. There were still barriers to break, biases to confront, and bridges to build. But they were ready to face the challenge. Their story, a journey of conflict, transformation, and ultimately reconciliation, had become a powerful tool for change. Together, they were using their experiences to help create a more inclusive and understanding world. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is potential for growth. With education, empathy, and a willingness to change, people could overcome their biases and build connections across divides. As the city slept around them, Ethan and Claire rested, ready to take on another day of challenging conversations and transformative work. Their journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The unexpected turn of events had unearthed deep truths and delivered a powerful message of redemption and change. Ethan's grace under pressure and Claire's willingness to confront her biases demonstrated that even the most challenging moments could lead to opportunities for profound growth and reconciliation. If Ethan and Claire's journey inspired you, don't forget to subscribe for more uplifting stories of courage, growth, and impact. And before you leave, we'd love to hear your thoughts. How do you think you would have handled a similar situation? Share your perspective in the comments below.